Welcome in, and thanks for joining us on a special edition of Experts at EWU. And today I'm joined by our expert from EWU, Patrick Jones, the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy and Economic Analysis at EWU. Patrick, thanks for taking the time to come on and join us and talk a little bit about the economic landscape, obviously kind of at the forefront of a lot of Americans' minds as we go further and further into this pandemic crisis. First of all, how are you holding up personally? How are you coping and surviving with everything going on?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm doing okay. My staff and I were all working from home, just like most everybody at the university is, and I think most of us are finding it to be a workable solution. I miss the interaction, obviously, among people, but we do communicate a little bit through email and, if needs be, with the phone. I'm also getting to know my wife a little better because we're taking walks. So that
there you go.
can't be
Yeah,
too bad.
no. Yeah, the walks and drives too is something that I've been doing just to remind myself that there is a world outside of my home and that people do exist and are still alive and living, although under very bizarre circumstances. The first thing that I kind of wanted to ask you about, as this just kind of came into play for a lot of Americans, are the stimulus checks that a lot have received. I was just kind of curious, in your opinion, with the amount and the approach and the execution of the stimulus check. What are your thoughts on the stimulus checks themselves and what they will be able to do for us, and if it's actually a sufficient device for stimulating the economy?
Well, I think there's two parts to the stimulus checks: some to business and some to workers. I think the size of the checks for a lot of the workers is going to be adequate to get them through the next 3 or 4 months. And we all hope that by 3 or 4 months they won't be necessary. I mean, they'll have them, but they'll be back at work. I think the problem lies in the whole program with just the size of the pool that was set aside for small business help, because what we're reading and hearing from various banks and GSI in particular is that the amount of money simply isn't enough to help out most of the small businesses that are hurting. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And if this were not to be the case, it would be much, much worse.
Yeah, I guess the next thing that I wanted to touch on, yeah, it's good for the people right now. We'll see long term what that ends up looking like, especially for the small businesses and such. But you were quoted on the April 2nd edition of the Inlander. Well, it actually cites that you gave a presentation to Mayor Woodward and her economic and recovery task force. I was wondering if you could give us some of the bullet points or the highlights of what that presentation consisted of and what you proposed.
Well, I didn't propose anything. I mean, I probably have my thoughts, but it wasn't my role. I'm in this context, I'm the analyst, and what I wanted to do to provide some information to the City Council, to Mayor Woodward, her cabinet, and others that were on the Economic Recovery Committee line is just to, first of all, get a sense of the size of the impact that we're all facing in Spokane County in terms of job loss. And then I wanted to break it down by sector. And there are tools within our data gathering machinery in the United States through either federal or the states to look at various levels of specificity by industry. And I broke it down into the top 20 categories. And those can be agriculture, finance, hospitals, or not hospitals, healthcare, and the like, and said, where are the losses likely to take place? And I did this on the basis of the governor's orders. I did this on the basis of sort of reading of the market. And then in the meantime, I've gotten some data from the Employment Security Department, which is our labor economics group in the state, that have supplemented those original findings. But the point is to inform, and I hope that will be useful as we, as a community, as a county, as a state, as we look into the ways that we will restart the economy. Because right now, the economy is pretty much in hibernation.
Yeah, to put it lightly, at least. Yeah, and we'll come back a little later to those sectors and the breakdown, and also some of the unemployment numbers that are unprecedented, I guess you could say. Also, just another article quote from the spokesman on April 9th. You were saying that different parts of the economy will recover in different ways. And I was wondering if you could just, I mean, there are logical assumptions that one can make from a statement like that, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more specifically upon what you meant by that.
Sure. So I think to sort of to take the negative, the parts of the economy that will come back the most slowly are those that are very much customer facing and involve quite a bit of density when that service or product is being sold. And so you can imagine what those are: restaurants, bars, to some degree retail, entertainment, where people mass together. And until we, as a society, figure out ways of mitigating the dangers of those gatherings, which would be obviously the gold standard solution is going to be having a vaccine, but that's not in the cards for the next year at least. Then what are the other mitigating strategies that we as a society can adopt to reduce the danger of transmission among ourselves? So those are the unfortunately, those sectors I think are going to be severely challenged to resume business as usual. On the other hand, there are those sectors such as construction that already use a bit of social distancing in most of their practices, and certainly can adopt further practices to ensure social distancing that could come back relatively quickly. And I think the same applies to manufacturing. But the devil's in the details, and we'll just have to see what the not recommendations, what the orders from the governor will likely be on how we proceed. But it seems to me there are some obvious front runners in getting back to work, and some obvious ones that will definitely have to do a few more, go through, in fact, many more steps to get back to a sort of a normal pace of business.
And again, we'll be able to take a look at some of those graphs and some of those numbers about the sectors that you were mentioning here in a second. One more question I kind of wanted to ask you out of curiosity as an economic analyst. Are there parallels or comparisons from the fallout and the recession of 2008 that have been looked at and trying to make sense of how we're going to rebound from this current recession that we're in right now? Or are they too starkly contrast? Are they just too different to be able to pull any useful information from?
Well, I think we will be pulling some useful information from some of the experience we had in 2008 and 2009, to some degree 2010, in that both episodes now have a large degree of anxiety and fear I think in the minds of a lot of consumers and a lot of workers, and so how we work through those particular attitudes, I think we can maybe draw from our experience in the prior recession. This one, though, is considerably different from the 2008-2009, because that was called a financial crisis, which it was, and this is not. I mean, this is something that is sort of a blanket just attack on our structure that's both demand driven. In other words, it affects people's willingness to spend money, and then it's affecting our ability to produce, in other words, the supply side. So that wasn't necessarily the case in the financial crash, where that was largely felt by certain sectors, which is obviously the financial sector, the banking sector, and then the housing sector. And so we had a recovery, and it took a long time to get there. And I think the hope of a lot of economists is that because this is not as fundamental as our banking system, which was pretty close to failing in 2008, 2009, that there are ways, if we can solve the medical and the public health problems, that we can get back and running at a quicker pace than we did after 2008, 2009.
Okay, and yeah, piggybacking off the topic of the sectors and everything. So you were mentioning, and hopefully I get this correctly, but that there's reason to think that looking at the unemployment numbers and kind of working our way back, that we can kind of start to make sense of things. As you mentioned, Inslee, Washington's governor, suggested that, and I think this is kind of obvious for most people, but the economy is not just going to light back up with a flick
Right.
of a switch. It's going to be more of a very steady and gradual process. So I would, yeah, go ahead and when the slides show up, if you could make sense and kind of navigate us through what these numbers mean and suggest, and how you kind of start looking at making sense of them.
Sure. So let's pull that first slide up, and I think it shows the sectors, these what we call super sectors. Well, here's the punchline, though. As long as we want to go there, my most recent estimate, which is now a bit dated, I just got some new data this afternoon that will bump this number up. But my most recent estimate, which was a few days ago, looked at jobs at risk. In other words, jobs that most likely will be lost, at least temporarily, to COVID-19, or about 43,000. And I did have a number that was much larger earlier. I was able to bring that down through conversations and interviews with folks. And if you just looked at that, and this is not the way unemployment rates are calculated, by the way, but if you just use that number and put it over the number of people employed in Spokane County in 2018, and we don't have 2019 numbers yet, that's almost 20% of the workforce. So these are unheard of numbers, and we're just, I think, looking at ways where they will be as short-lived as possible. There are some caveats to that, because this assumes that everybody is unemployed, and in fact, there are people who are using their benefits over this time, I found out, and so that they're really not unemployed. And so that would make the number lower. On the other hand, and I hate to even think about this, there's a large group of people in our economy that are sole proprietors, contractors, the so-called gig workers, that aren't part of these numbers typically. And yet the stimulus package, that was the CARES Act that was passed, will actually give money, unemployment sort of insurance funds, to these folks for the first time. And they'll have the same sort of structure as those who are part of the unemployment insurance system to begin with. And so that's going to mean actually probably a number up in the 20% range when those folks start declaring that they're unemployed and therefore eligible. But that's the punchline right now, is just numbers that we haven't seen ever in our lifetimes. You'd probably have to go back to the Great Depression of the early 30s to find something like that. The only solace we can take in all this is that many of these will be very short-lived effects. And that's what I'm trying to get at is, okay, so which sectors, especially that are large sectors, can get back to work relatively quickly and bring these jaw-dropping numbers down?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, attempting, especially in a time like this, to look for a silver lining amidst all the realistic negativity that kind of surrounds and is brought about by the entire situation. Was there any additional information that you think is pressing or important to cover that I haven't asked about or brought up before we let you go here?
Well, are we gonna look at those charts or
We do
not?
still need to go through. Yeah, we can bring up the next slides.
Okay, so if we consider just what is at stake, I don't know if people can see this that well. It's a little blurry on my screen, but these are the 5 largest sectors by employment in our community. So healthcare, government number 2, retail, trade, accommodation, food services, is manufacturing. So if you look at those sectors that have been affected by the governor's order and COVID-19, it's a really mixed bag of these top 5. Healthcare, in many ways, is positively impacted in that there's a huge need for people on the front lines, and what these folks are going through is just beyond belief, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Government
absolutely.
is federal, state, and local includes school districts. And by and large, my read is that until very recently, most government jobs are pretty safe. That may change as we get into the longer term effects, but in the intermediate term, or just the short term, which is what I'm looking at here, most of those people still have their jobs. The next 2 sectors are the ones that have been badly hit: retail,
Hmm.
trade, and accommodations and food services. And so these are very customer facing, and it's unlikely that many parts of these 2 large sectors in Spokane's economy are going to come back quickly. And the final one is manufacturing. And manufacturing has been hit, but not nearly as bad as retail, trade, and the hospitality business. So we still have today, as we speak, many factories in Spokane still running pretty well. So understanding that that's the backdrop is, I think, helpful for understanding how we come back. And then this next particular graph looks at the 10 largest next sectors. There's 20 altogether here. And notably, construction is number 6. And construction is something that you may have read about, that a lot of pressure is being brought to bear by the industry to the governors and to Olympia in general, that these folks could be back at work if the order were lifted. And I know there are definite health concerns about transmission among construction workers, but it seems to me, since a lot of this involves people at some distance to each other, that this might be one of those sectors that gets back to work fast. In other states, construction has been viewed generally as an essential service, and so there are parts of the construction trade that are now an essential service, but many parts are not. And so I think this is an opportunity. And then we go on down the line, and the numbers get a little smaller. Administrative and waste services is largely administrative services, which are temporary jobs, and that depends how they get sectored out, or what sort of jobs they find on a temp basis. And it includes call centers. And these folks haven't been as badly hit as I thought they would be, but I haven't seen the latest data yet. Wholesale trade involves both automobiles and food. So automobiles have been shut down in terms of new automobiles anyway. Parts have not, and yet food is still flowing heavily. And then the 9th largest sector is our white collar work, professional and technical services. Those involve people who have the ability to work remotely, and I think many of them are. So, we can go on further, but I don't want to spend the remaining minutes we have just going on through all these. But just to point out that they all have various profiles, if you will, in how they've been hit. And so this next graph really is the heart of my analysis, is looking at my best estimate of the job losses in certain sectors. And as you can see at the very top of the list are accommodation and food services, followed by retail trade. And these are, as you just saw, the 3rd and 4th largest sectors in the economy, and they are also the sectors that have the highest percentage of job losses. And then you go on down the line of construction. It ranks 3rd in the way I come up with my tally, and then followed by those temporary jobs, those call centers, and finally a sector that is a small sector, arts, entertainment, and recreation, but nearly everyone's been shut down in that particular industry, in part because that's where a lot of people congregate, and that's not what we want these days, or that's not what is allowed these days. So this is just a bit of the specifics behind the job losses. And the next slide basically just shows that once you get beyond those top 10, it really trails off. And there are some sectors, utilities and agriculture, where I'm not anticipating any job loss. So it just varies about where you get your paycheck. And, that's to a large degree unfair, but that's just the way the COVID virus is making an impact on our society. So the next two slides are just percentage changes, and I don't think we need to go through those. That's really the heart of my tally, Andrew. That just shows, for example, on that very top line, arts, entertainment, and recreation, nearly everyone, I presume, is out of work. And in hotels and restaurants and bars, not everyone, but certainly a huge majority is out of work. And then I don't think we need to talk too much about the rest, but there is a great variation in what sectors have been unscathed and what sectors are really in the eye of the storm.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to go over a lot of those. And because, I mean, a couple of them you would or would not think that they'd be greatly impacted, and it might be, the exact opposite. I mean, just as I've talked to a lot of people, it's been interesting to see what very niche industries have actually soared and prospered during this times versus, people on the opposite end of the spectrum. Right. So now I will ask you again, was there anything else that you think it would be good for the audience to know and cover before we let you get on with the rest of your day?
Well, thank you. I think the real challenge now is going beyond these short-term estimates and figuring out how do we get back to some sort of normality, and it's going to be not the same as before. And I'll just say that I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on this on my own, and looking at examples across the globe, because we do have good examples. We have certainly the European countries recently, the Czech Republic, Norway, Denmark, to some degree Germany, are announcing, we are lifting the orders that we had before about staying home. And so I think that, and also we've seen in Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong really haven't had to shut down at all. So I think we just need to learn from these particular countries, and knowing that we as a society are somewhat hamstrung because we don't have the infrastructure that some of these European and Asian countries have, with having the right amount of PPEs, without having the tests, without having the contact tracing that they're all able to do. And so, as Dr. Fauci has said on TV many times, the virus will determine the pace, but yet I think our effort from the medical side of things will determine to a large degree how quickly we can reopen for business.
Certainly. A lot of really good, great information diving into the depths of the analysis aspect of economics and what's going on within our country. And yeah, in comparison to the rest of the world, as you were just mentioning. I'm sure we'll probably be checking in with you again soon down the road when you get new numbers and new developments have taken place. But again, thank you for taking the time to spend with us today and giving our audience a real good understanding of what it is going from an economical standpoint within our country right now. Stay safe, stay sane, and take care. And yeah, we'll probably be talking to you very soon. Thank you, Patrick.
I'd be happy to do that, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
You bet.
Okay.